This video is sponsored by Daedalic and GameExcite.
Intrepid-class, sustainable cruise velocity of warp factor 9.975. 15 decks, crew complement of 141, bioneural circuitry.
By the early 2370s, Starfleet was no longer operating in the same galaxy it had known a decade earlier. Expansion had pushed the Federation farther than ever before. New colonies were appearing along distant frontiers, trade routes were stretching across regions that had barely been charted, and exploratory missions were no longer brief excursions beyond a secure core. Starfleet ships were spending longer periods away from home, often positioned where help was days or weeks away. Distance, once an inconvenience, was beginning to shape policy. A single crisis had exposed how fragile that sense of security really was. A powerful enemy, the Borg, had reached Federation space and left a trail of destruction that forced Starfleet to confront something it had not faced in generations. The reality it could be outmatched, outmaneuvered, and caught unprepared. The shock of that moment lingered long after the battle ended. Ship design, deployment patterns, and command priorities all began to shift in response. At the same time, the frontier was becoming harder to define. Tensions simmered along contested borders, such as that with the Cardassians. Unknown powers were beginning to test the edges of explored space. Reports from deep-range missions hinted at threats that did not behave like traditional enemies. There was no single opponent to point to, no clear war to prepare for. Only a growing sense that the next major crisis might not announce itself until it was already underway. Starfleet's answer to this uncertainty was not a single ship, but a new kind of thinking. Instead of building vessels meant to remain close to established territories, or vessels meant to just explore, planners began prioritizing flexibility. Missions were expected to last longer. Ships were expected to travel further. Crews were expected to operate with fewer guarantees of support. The scale of exploration had changed, and the margin for error had narrowed with it. The Intrepid-class emerged from that environment. Smaller than the massive cruisers that once symbolized Starfleet's presence, it carried a different kind of confidence. Its size reflected efficiency rather than limitation. Its mission profile suggested movement rather than performance. Everything about its introduction hinted at a fleet adjusting to new realities without fully abandoning the ideals that had guided it for generations. Early assignments placed ships of this class at the edge of known space, tasked with scientific surveys, reconnaissance, and long-range patrols. These missions demanded adaptability. One day a vessel might be charting a nebula, the next negotiating with a newly encountered civilization, and after that responding to a distress call from a colony that had no one else to rely on. The work was unpredictable, and the distance from reinforcement was often measured in weeks. This was not the first time Starfleet had sent ships far from home. Exploration had always carried that risk. What had changed was the expectation that a single ship might have to handle whatever it found without immediate backup. As the Federation grew, so did the number of places where help might be needed, and the number of unknowns that could emerge without warning. The Intrepid-class arrived at a moment when the old assumptions were beginning to shift. It was introduced quietly, without the political weight attached to larger, more imposing vessels. It did not represent a dramatic declaration or a public display of strength. Instead, it slipped into service as part of a broader adjustment already underway across the fleet. What made it significant was not a single battle or a single mission. Its importance came from the kind of work it was expected to do from the very beginning. Operate far from the center, move quickly between assignments, and remain effective when conditions changed without warning. As the 2370s approached, Starfleet found itself managing a territory larger and more complex than anything it had overseen before. Threats could emerge from directions that had once been considered safe. New powers were rising beyond the edges of familiar space. The sense of certainty that had defined earlier decades was fading, replaced by something more cautious, more watchful. Within that atmosphere, the Intrepid-class took its place among the fleet. It did not arrive as a symbol of war or as a relic of peace. It arrived as a part of a transition, a ship built for a time when the next crisis might be distant, unexpected, and already in motion before anyone realized it had begun. But expansion created a new problem Starfleet wasn't prepared for. The old assumption, that danger would come to the Federation was about to stop working. If you're anything like me, you've watched Star Trek Voyager and thought, Janeway did a solid job in getting her crew home, and absolutely none of her decisions got anyone killed.
They're all dead!
But let's be honest, there are a few choices I probably would have made differently. Tuvix? Saved. Harry Kim? Promoted. Neelix? Still negotiating his contract. In this game, you take command of the USS Voyager from day one. From hunting the Maquis to dealing with the caretaker, and everything after, you decide what happens next. It is entirely up to you. You manage the ship, its systems, its crew, and its resources, deciding whether to rebuild living spaces, restore stellar cartography, or push Voyager's technology in risky new directions. You'll explore the Delta Quadrant, lead away missions, face ship-to-ship combat, and even decide whether using Borg technology is worth the cause. And because it's built with roguelike elements, no two runs play out the same. Your choices actually matter. Star Trek Voyager: Across the Unknown launches February 18th on PC, PS5, Xbox Series S and X, and Nintendo Switch 2. You can check it out right now by clicking the link at the top of the description. Supporting the sponsors supports the channel. Now let's just get back into it. For most of its history, Starfleet operated on a single assumption. If danger came, it would come to the Federation. That belief shaped patrol patterns, deployment strategy, and how ships were positioned across known space. Defensive lines formed along contested borders. Heavier vessels stayed within reach of major worlds. When trouble started, it was expected to be visible. A border crossed, a distress call sent, a confrontation unfolding in real time. Reinforcements would move to meet it. For generations, that model worked. Then the nature of the threat began to change. A conflict could begin and peak before Starfleet's response system had time to organize. Soon after, a different kind of danger began taking shape far beyond Federation's territory. Deep-range assignments started returning with reports of a powerful force controlling entire regions of space. These were not raiders, nor isolated aggressors. Other civilizations had already been absorbed. Their fleets had already been destroyed. Expansion by this new force was methodical, deliberate, and sustained. Starfleet would come to know this power as the Dominion. The distance changed the equation. If a conflict began in those regions, there would be no border to reinforce and no early warning line to hold. The ship already present would be the only response for a long time. At the same time, the Federation itself was becoming harder to protect as a single, unified space. Colonies spread into distant sectors. Trade routes stretched through newly charted regions. Scientific teams operated weeks from the nearest support. A crisis no longer had to begin at a frontier to become dangerous. It could start at a remote outpost, along a shipping corridor, or in territory that had never required defense before. The frontier wasn't a line anymore. It was everywhere. Exploration vessels found themselves taking on a new kind of responsibility. They were often the first to detect instability, the first to investigate, and the first to respond when something went wrong. If they failed, there might not be a second chance. Support would come eventually, but presence came first. Starfleet began adjusting to that reality. Instead of concentrating strength along defensive borders, planners started valuing ships that could reach trouble quickly, assess it, and stabilize it long enough for a larger response to follow. Coverage began to matter more than concentration. Early arrival began to shape outcomes. This shift formed the foundation of what would become known as anticipation doctrine. It was built on a simple recognition. The next major threat might not come from a direction anyone was watching. It might be discovered by a single ship on routine assignment, far from home and far from immediate support. In that moment, the outcome would depend on whether that vessel could hold the situation together long enough for the Federation to respond. The Intrepid-class fit directly into that thinking. Ships of this type were assigned to wide patrol zones and deep-range missions, placed in regions where uncertainty was a part of the assignment. They were expected to survey distant space, respond to scattered emergencies, and investigate early signs of instability. Speed mattered because response windows were shrinking. Endurance mattered because reinforcement would take time. Flexibility mattered because no one could predict what the next call for help would look like. Under those conditions, a slower response was often the same as no response at all. So Starfleet began building ships meant to move first, see first, act first. Not to fight wars alone, but to keep small problems from becoming larger ones before the rest of the fleet could arrive. If threats could appear anywhere, then response time would decide everything. And that meant that mobility was no longer optional. Speed had always mattered in exploration. A faster ship could reach distant regions, complete surveys more efficiently, and maintain contact across greater distances. For most of Starfleet's history, that advantage was measured in scientific return and operational convenience. By the early 2370s, speed began carrying a different kind of weight. Distance had become a strategic problem. A distress signal could be sent, but reinforcement might still be days or weeks away. Under those conditions, the first ship to arrive often shaped what happened next. Reaching a crisis early could mean stabilizing a situation before it escalated. A vessel arriving ahead of a broader response had time to assess what was happening, assist local defenses, evacuate civilians, or contain the damage before it spread. Even a short delay could allow a threat to entrench itself, spread to nearby systems, or disappear before anyone understood what had happened. This began to change how Starfleet thought about mobility. A ship was no longer just a platform for exploration. It was a rapid responder by default. It needed to move quickly between assignments, cross large regions without delay, and reposition as conditions shifted. Being fast was no longer about efficiency or prestige. It was about arriving in time to make decisions that could shape the outcome. The Intrepid-class reflected that priority. From the beginning, its design emphasized movement. It was built to operate across wide patrol areas and to shift from one mission to another without long refit periods or support stops. Assignments could change with little warning. A vessel charting a distant region might be redirected to assist a colony, then sent to investigate an anomaly, then tasked with delivering supplies to an isolated outpost. The expectation was constant motion. This made the class well suited to the realities Starfleet was beginning to face. A ship capable of maintaining high cruising speeds over long distances could cover more territory, respond to more incidents, and remain relevant across multiple sectors. It did not have to wait for a fleet to form or command structure to assemble. It could move immediately. Starfleet planners began to see speed as a form of protection. Not protection in the traditional sense of armor or weaponry, but in the ability to shorten the gap between the start of a problem and the arrival of assistance. The smaller that gap became, the more likely it was that a situation could be contained rather than allowed to grow. The Intrepid-class was built to operate inside that window. Its role was not to replace larger ships or project power across entire regions. It was meant to reach the places where something was beginning to happen and hold the line long enough for others to follow. That required endurance, adaptability, and sustained velocity. A vessel that could not maintain pace over long distances would always be reacting too late. By the time ships of the class entered service, Starfleet was no longer planning around static defense positions. The frontier was shifting and problems could emerge in places that had never needed protection before. Mobility became a form of readiness. A ship that could move first could see first, and a ship that could see first had the chance to act before a situation hardened into something more dangerous. The Intrepid-class was designed to live in that space, constantly in motion, positioned to reach whatever came next. But arriving first was only half the battle. Staying there, alone, was the real test. Speed could get a ship to the scene. Staying there was a different problem entirely. Early arrival only mattered if the vessel that responded could remain effective after it got there. A fast ship that had to withdraw quickly would buy time, but not stability. If a crisis stretched on for days or weeks, the first responder needed to hold position, adapt, and continue operating without immediate reinforcement. That requirement began to shape how Starfleet evaluated what a frontline vessel needed to be. Independence was no longer just a trait of exploration. It was becoming an operational expectation. Assignments were increasingly pulling ships into regions where there was no nearby fleet to rely on, no station to resupply from, and no guarantee that help could arrive on short notice. A mission might begin as a routine survey and turn into something far more complicated. A quiet patrol could suddenly place a ship between a colony and a developing threat. Once committed, that vessel would have to manage the situation with whatever it carried. Operating alone demanded a different kind of preparation. Crews needed to be capable of handling multiple roles without support. Commanders needed the flexibility to make decisions that would normally be handled at higher levels. Equipment had to serve more than one purpose. A ship might be conducting research one week and acting as a defensive presence the next. The expectation was not specialization, it was adaptability. The Intrepid-class was built with that environment in mind. This balance gave the Intrepid-class a unique role. It could investigate anomalies, support struggling colonies, deliver aid, and hold position in unstable regions without needing to withdraw the moment conditions changed. It was not meant to rely on nearby fleets or constant resupply. It was meant to function as a self-contained command presence in whatever region it was assigned. Larger ships could project power and absorb punishment, but they required more resources, larger crews, and more structured support. A vessel expected to remain on the move across distant sectors needed a different profile. It had to be efficient enough to sustain itself and flexible enough to adapt to changing demands without needing to return home after every assignment. The Intrepid-class filled that role by design. Its smaller crew allowed for tighter coordination and reduced logistical strain. Internal systems were arranged to support long-duration operations without constant maintenance cycles. Departments were structured so the same ship could transition between scientific work, diplomatic contact, emergency response, and defensive action without needing to be reconfigured between assignments. That versatility made it possible to stay active in regions where there was no infrastructure to rely on. This kind of ship did not replace larger vessels. It complemented them. Where a fleet could bring overwhelming force, an independent ship could bring presence. It could arrive early, remain in position, and keep a situation from deteriorating while a broader response was organized. In regions where there was no permanent Federation presence, that single vessel effectively became the Federation for as long as it remained on station. A ship operating alone represented Starfleet policy, authority, and capability in places where no one else could step in. Decisions made in isolation could shape entire regions. A crew might be the only line between a colony and a growing conflict. That reality required a vessel that could endure pressure, maintain operations, and continue functioning long after the first moment of danger had passed. The Intrepid-class was built to endure in that role. It was not defined by overwhelming firepower or symbolic presence. Its strength came from its ability to remain where it was needed, adapt as conditions changed, and continue operating long after the first moment of danger had passed. And once a ship was expected to operate alone, another question followed. What happened when the situation turned hostile? Starfleet did not set out to turn every new design into a combat vessel. For generations, its identity had been built around exploration, diplomacy, scientific discovery. Ships were meant to represent stability and cooperation. Even when conflicts emerged, the fleet's posture remained grounded in presence rather than intimidation. A vessel might be capable of defending itself, but it was not built to seek confrontation. That balance was becoming harder to maintain. The threats Starfleet was beginning to encounter were not limited to isolated raiders or border incidents. Some possessed the strength to overwhelm entire defensive positions. Others operated through long-term expansion, quietly absorbing territory until resistance became impossible. The result was a growing pressure to ensure that even ships assigned to peaceful missions could protect themselves if the situation turned dangerous. This created a design tension. Building a dedicated warship meant sacrificing the flexibility and range needed for exploration. Building a purely scientific vessel meant risking lives if it was caught unprepared. Starfleet needed ships that could continue its core mission while still surviving in a more hostile environment. The solution was not to transform every class into a weapon. It was to build ships that could endure conflict without being defined by it. The Intrepid-class was shaped by that compromise. It carried enough defensive strength to protect itself, its crew, and any civilians under its care, but it was not designed to dominate a battlefield. Its weapons were intended for survival, not conquest. Its shielding and tactical systems allowed it to remain in dangerous situations long enough to stabilize them, not to wage sustained campaigns. This was still a ship built for discovery, yet it could not ignore the reality of the era it was entering. In those moments, the line between explorer and defender disappeared. The ship did not have to retreat the moment a situation became tense. This reflected a broader shift in Starfleet's thinking. War was no longer something that happened far away, separate from exploration. It could begin in places where a scientific vessel was the only Starfleet presence for light years. If that ship could not defend itself, it could not defend anyone else. The ability to survive contact with hostile forces was becoming a baseline requirement rather than a specialized role. The Intrepid-class answered the need without abandoning Starfleet's identity. It was not built to replace larger tactical ships or to lead assaults. It was meant to remain active in contested regions, to continue its mission even when the environment became unstable, and to protect what was within its reach until reinforcements arrived. Its strength was measured in resilience rather than firepower. In a fleet increasingly shaped by uncertainty, that kind of balance mattered. A ship that could explore, respond, endure, defend, without becoming defined by combat represented a different kind of preparation. It showed a Starfleet that was adapting to a more dangerous galaxy while still holding on to the purpose that had guided it for centuries. The Intrepid-class stood at that intersection, ready for peace, but built to survive whatever came next. By the early 2370s, Starfleet wasn't just preparing to survive danger. It was preparing to recognize it before it fully formed. A theory can guide a design. Only experience proves whether it works. For the Intrepid-class, that proof came not through a single planned mission, but through circumstance. A ship built for speed, independence, and adaptability was suddenly forced into a situation no one had intended. Cut off from support, separated from the Federation, and placed in a region where no reinforcements could reach it, the design was tested in the most unforgiving way possible. What followed was not a demonstration of strength alone. It was a demonstration of endurance. Operating without a nearby starbase meant every system had to hold up over time. Repairs had to be made with limited resources. Scientific equipment had to continue functioning even while the ship handled emergencies and threats. Medical facilities had to serve not just as support for routine operations, but as the primary line of care for a crew that could not rely on outside help. Every part of the vessel was pushed into roles that extended far beyond what a normal deployment would have required. The ship held together. Long-range travel had always been a part of the USS Voyager's role, but now it became a necessity rather than a choice. Assignments changed constantly. One moment required diplomacy, another required defensive action, another demanded scientific investigation. Without the ability to return home, the crew had to depend on the ship's flexibility to survive. Voyager was built to adapt, and in this environment, that adaptability became the difference between continuing forward and being stranded. Its speed also took on new meaning. The ability to move quickly across unfamiliar regions allowed it to avoid threats, reach potential allies, and reposition itself when situations became unstable. In a place where every encounter carried risk, mobility became a form of protection. It allowed the ship to choose where to engage, when to withdraw, and when to focus on survival rather than confrontation. Its independence proved just as important. There was no nearby fleet to rely on, no supply chain waiting beyond the next system. Every mission required careful decisions about how resources were used, how risks were taken, and how long the ship could remain operational. A vessel built for short assignments would have struggled to remain effective. A vessel designed to sustain itself could continue moving, adapting, surviving. That is where the Intrepid-class showed what it was capable of. It was able to continue scientific work even while facing constant danger. It could offer aid when it encountered others in need. It could defend itself when forced into conflict. It could move quickly enough to stay ahead of situations that might otherwise have overwhelmed it. None of these traits existed in isolation. They worked together, allowing the ship to function as a complete, self-contained presence far from home. This was not how the class was originally meant to be used. It had been built to operate alone for extended periods, but always with the expectation that it remained part of the larger network. The idea was that a ship might spend long stretches away from support, not that it would be entirely cut off from it. Yet, when Voyager was placed in that position, the design held. That outcome revealed something important. A vessel created for anticipation, speed, and endurance could survive even when the situation went far beyond what its designers had planned. The same qualities that made it effective as an early responder also made it capable of enduring isolation. The same flexibility that allowed it to move between missions allowed it to adapt to conditions no one could have predicted. What had been built as a forward operating ship became a long-term survivor. That was not a matter of luck. It was the result of design choices made for a different purpose. A ship meant to operate independently across distant regions already carried the tools it needed to continue functioning without support. When the unexpected happened, those tools became essential. The Intrepid-class had been created to reach the next crisis first. What happened next proved it could do far more than that. What the ship endured wasn't an accident. It was the result of how Starfleet had already begun to think.